Grandpa Reed Productions now present Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's... Oops, not that one. Try again. Grandpa Reed Productions now present Freddy the Politician, Chapter 4. So here's the first page of Chapter 4. You may recall last week, when we finished Chapter 3, the animals had opened their bank, and it was very popular. In fact, it was almost too popular. The animals had brought so many precious, valuable things to put in the bank that there was no room for anything else. And they still had to put quite a lot more in, because Mr. Bean had decided to put all his money in the animal bank. How will they make a big enough vault for all that stuff? Let's find out as we read Chapter 4 of Freddy the Politician. On the other side of the stone wall that divided the orchard from the back pasture stood an old gnarled apple tree. There was a hole in the trunk right by the ground, and in it lived a fox named John. John was one of the woods animals who had come down to live on the farm because they wanted to take part in the gay social life of the animal farm. A great many squirrels had moved down, and several porcupines and raccoons, and even Peter the bear often came down for a week when there was something special going on. When John had first moved into the apple tree, Charles the rooster and his wife Henrietta had been very much upset, for there is nothing that a fox would rather have for supper than a nice, plump chicken, unless it is two plump chickens. But a committee consisting of Robert and Mrs. Wiggins had called on John and made him promise to leave the chickens alone. John promised readily enough, for he liked society, and there wasn't much of that up in the wild and lonely woods. And anyway, he didn't especially care for chicken. What he really liked was duck, but he didn't tell the committee that. The hole in the apple tree was pretty small. It was so small that John could just get himself in when he curled up tight, and even then he had to leave his bushy tail outside. But he didn't mind, for he said, "I'm not in it very much. I spend most of my time outdoors when I'm awake. All I really need is a place to sleep." One afternoon, Freddy left the bank early and trotted off down through the orchard. He sprang over the wall as lightly as a cat, for although Freddy was getting fat, he exercised regularly, and like many fat people, was very light on his feet. He was a wonderful dancer. As he walked toward the apple tree, he paused to admire the cloud effects, and he murmured a verse or two of poetry to himself. Like most pigs, he was extremely artistic. He often felt that he might have been a great painter, if he had only had time to turn his hand to it. "A lovely bank of clouds," he said to himself as he moved on, and then he shook his head crossly. "Now, why did I say bank? Good gracious, can't I get my mind off business for a second?" When he came to the tree, he saw a reddish, bushy tail sticking out of the hole, and he was about to knock when he noticed a small sign tied to the end of the tail. The sign said, "Out." "Oh dear," said Freddy. "Now I'll have to come back again this evening," and he was about to turn away when the tail was whisked in and then pushed out again immediately with another sign on it which said, "In." So Freddy knocked on the tree. The tail was withdrawn again, and John's sharp little nose poked out. "Why, Freddy," said the fox, "this is a pleasant surprise. Come in, come in. No, just a minute. I'll have to come out first." For his house was so small that if he wanted to entertain anybody in it, he had to sit outside himself. Let's just sit out here together," said the pig. So they sat down under the apple tree, which was covered with white blossoms, and Freddy said, "Why the signs, John? I could see you were in, with your tail sticking out in plain sight." "That's just the trouble," said the fox. "It's the only drawback to this house. Of course, I'm always in for you, Freddy, when you come to call, but there are some animals that come, well, I name no names, but you know how it is. They just never go home. Now, if I had a regular-sized house, I just wouldn't answer when they knocked, or my butler would go and tell them I was not at home. But when they can see me, well, I thought if I had the signs made, then when they saw it and it said out, they'd understand I wasn't seeing anybody and go away." "Does it work?" asked Freddy. "No. That is, with some of the more polite ones it does. But there are some. Why, that skunk Sniffy Wilson came yesterday. I had the out sign on my tail, and do you think he went away? He did not. He actually pulled my tail until I answered him. Said he thought it was a doorbell. Some people simply don't know how to behave, Freddy. That's all there is to it." "Well, Sniffy's kind of free and easy, and that's a fact," said Freddy. "But he's a good fellow, always willing to help you out if you're in a jam. Well, that's one reason I came over to see you today. We're in sort of a jam at the bank. We've got to have some more vaults built, and this time it's a job for highly skilled labor. It's no woodchuck proposition. The rooms are full now, and even the tunnel is so cluttered up with stuff that the clerks can hardly get through. You're just the animal for the job, if you'll take it." Freddy was very diplomatic. He knew how to make people want to do the things he wanted them to do. John felt very much flattered, and he agreed at once to come and do the necessary digging. So they gossiped for a while, and then John said, "There's some talk up in the woods, Freddy, that you've given up the idea of founding a republic and electing a president. I hope that isn't so." "Oh, no," said Freddy, and he explained that they had merely taken John Quincy's advice about getting the bank going first. "It's sound advice, I think," said the pig. "Once we start having elections, speeches, and going out after votes, nobody is going to pay much attention to the bank. But I think we'll get at it pretty soon now." "Well, I hope so," said the fox, "and of course it's none of my business. Well, it is in a way, of course, because I'm a citizen of the republic, if there is a republic, and, well, go ahead," said Freddy. "You're among friends." "Well," said John, "I wouldn't take too much woodpecker advice if I were you. I don't trust those boys, and that's a fact. Don't ask me why, it's just a feeling. Don't you have those feelings?" "Well, now you mention it," said Freddy, "I guess I do. Weasels now, I don't trust weasels. And yet I haven't any reason not to, really. I don't know much about them. They may be the kindest, nicest people in the world, but somehow—" "Yeah," said John, "that's just how I feel about woodpeckers. Well, anyway, I just thought I'd mention it." "Glad you did," said Freddy. "Glad you did. I'll keep it in mind. Well, I guess I must be getting back." So he said goodbye, and John hung the outside on the end of his tail and crawled back into his house and took a nap. When Freddy got back to the bank, Jinx, who had not been in all day, was still not there, and John Quincy was very much upset. "We've got to do something about Jinx, Freddy," he said. "He's supposed to be here from 10 to 3. just like the rest of us. But sometimes he doesn't come in for days at a time." Freddy's ears turned pink, for he had not been any too punctual himself. He seldom got up before 10 o'clock in the morning, and by the time he had done his exercises and had a leisurely breakfast and worked a while at his poetry and his plans for the election, it was time for dinner, and then after dinner there was his nap and various other things to be seen to, so that he often didn't get to the bank before 2:30, and the bank closed at 3. "Oh, well," he said, "we mustn't be too hard on Jinx. After all, there's always somebody here." "There's always me here," said John Quincy. "Not that I mind the extra work, but it's the principle of the thing. 10 to 3. Those are our hours, and we're all supposed to be here." "Oh, there he is now," he said, as Jinx poked his head in the door. "Hi, gents," said the cat breezily. "Boy, what a day! What a day I've had! Ah, spring, spring! I made a poem about it, Freddy. Hooray for the spring, what a glorious feeling! All the little lambs on the hillside squealing. Tighten up your braces, tuck in your shirt. All the little green things growing in the dirt." I didn't really see any lambs, though. Spent most of the day chasing butterflies. Ah, what is more uplifting, my friends, than to sally forth in the glorious springtide and chase butterflies across the hills of bean? "Indeed," said John Quincy dryly. "And while you have been enjoying the spring, I have been slaving here in a stuffy office." "Ha! The more fool you," said Jinx. "Anyway, you like to slave and stuff, doesn't he, Freddy?" "Please leave me out of it," said Freddy nervously, for John Quincy was beginning to tap nervously on the counter with his beak, a sure sign with woodpeckers that there is going to be a row. "That is not the point," said John Quincy, suddenly raising his voice. "As an officer of this bank, it is your plain duty to be here in banking hours. Suppose Mr. Bean comes in and wants to talk to the treasurer, and I have to tell him the treasurer's out chasing butterflies. What kind of a bank is that? We've had quite enough of this, Jinx. As president of this bank, and your superior officer—" "As president of this bank and my superior officer," interrupted Jinx, "you can go soak your head in a rain barrel. You're right, we've had enough of it. I'm through. I started this bank to have some fun, not to be a woodpecker's slave. I quit, do you hear? I resign." And with a swipe of his paw, he knocked John Quincy off the counter and leaped out of the door. "I'm sorry, JQ," said Freddy as the woodpecker picked himself up and smoothed down his feathers, "but you did ask for it. That's no way to handle Jinx. He's a good fellow, but—" "There's only one way to handle animals like him," said John Quincy, "and that's with a firm hand." "I should say that Jinx was the one that used the firm hand," remarked Pig. "However, we're out of treasure, and we'll have to have one. Who do you suggest?" They talked for a time about possible candidates for the office of treasurer, but they might as well have saved their breath, for as they soon found out that none of the animals on the farm wanted the job. Most of them, the dogs and the cows and Hank the old white horse, had their regular jobs on the farm, so they could not possibly work at banking from 10 to 3, and the others were hardly fitted for such a responsible position. Indeed, the only one who really wanted to be treasurer was Charles the rooster. Charles was rather pompous and was much esteemed as a public speaker, by everyone, that is, but his wife Henrietta, and would in some ways have made a good bank treasurer, but his judgment wasn't very good, and that is a grave fault in either a rooster or a treasurer. So Freddy and John Quincy both said no. "We've got to do something, though," said John Quincy. "We can't do business without a treasurer. Now, I've been thinking it over, and if it's agreeable to you, I'll fly down to Washington over the weekend and have a talk with Father. I think perhaps I can persuade him to come up and take charge. He likes good food, Father does, and I will say that the bugs in New York State are the finest I've ever tasted." "Well," said Freddy, "I must say I don't see why you and I can't run the bank. After all, there are days when nobody comes in at all." "And there are days when somebody like Mr. Bean comes in," said John Quincy. "And what's he going to think if there isn't any treasurer? Is he going to put his money in a bank that isn't properly run?" "Oh, I suppose not," said Freddy. "And, my gracious, it would be awful if he decided we couldn't run a bank properly. He'd think we couldn't run the farm, and then he wouldn't take that trip abroad, and Mrs. Bean has been counting on it so." "Don't you worry," said John Quincy. "We can run the farm all right. We'll get at this election pretty soon and fix the whole thing up." "We," said Freddy to himself as he bent over his ledger. "Somehow I don't like that 'we' very much." And that brings us to the end of Chapter 4. I hope everyone enjoyed it. I hope you all have beautiful dreams, and I'll see you next time when we continue reading Freddy the Politician, Chapter 5. Sweet dreams.